Good afternoon. I have the great pleasure of moderating today's debate, which is part of the series of big questions here in Cracow. Last year, we had a fantastic debate between Professors Daniel Dennett and Micah Heller, which you may want to look at. But today we're going to discuss the problem of free will with two fantastic guests. To my right, Professor John Dylan Haynes, Professor of Neuroscience, and to my left, Professor Bartosz Brozek, Professor of Law and Philosophy, also interested in cognitive science. So we have an excellent situation to talk about the brain and the mind and the problem of free will. To kick off, I would like to ask you, Professor Haynes, to walk us through very briefly the process of actually making a decision. So let's imagine that my skull is transparent and we can readily see my brain activity. Let's say that my neurons emit a nice reddish glow when they're working. And I am asked to press one of two buttons, left or right. So could you walk us through what's happening in my brain when this happens?
So there are two very different types of decisions that we encounter when we study the human brain. One is what you might call a reactive decision. You show some picture, some stimulus to a person. It impinges on their retina. It gets processed by the visual system and analyzed. So we recognize the components in the image. We might have to, if the image is blurred or unclear, we might have to integrate information across a few seconds just to be sure about what we're seeing. And in the next stage, we would be assigning some kind of value to different choice options, which would happen in prefrontal cortex. That's the region for kind of high-level decision making.
Here?
Yes. And in the region of what's called the basal ganglia, which is a subcortical structure that is involved
Deep
in
there,
kind of down here in the depth. And that's a region that is involved in kind of, might say, more habitual control of behavior, but also in the assignment of values to choice options. And finally, we would send the signal to the motor areas of the brain, where they would go down what's called the pyramidal tract, which is basically the connection between the neocortex and the muscles. And then finally, we would actually move, innervate our muscles, and then we would press a corresponding button. That is a reactive decision. There's a quite different type of decision with what you might call endogenous decisions. Decisions where there's no immediate stimulus in your environment that is causing you to act. But say, for example, when you're contemplating where to go on holiday or when you're contemplating what to study, in these cases, we might not always be able to trace a decision back to a single stimulus that was the kind of cause. And in these cases, what seems to happen is that there is a preparation of a decision in prefrontal cortex that seems to be outside of consciousness, so we're not aware of these processes going on. And then once the decision materializes, then the regions involved in the execution of the decision, again, motor cortex regions, will become involved.
Okay, but basically, for a person like such as yourself, you're doing a lot of imaging. It's basically waves of activity of an organ. That's sort of the whole point of today's discussion. That's this area is activated, a different area is activated. The waves just flow across the brain, right? And I would say, for a philosopher, how does this work? I mean, for instance, we had the same sentence, the term prefrontal cortex, and then I know that something happened. Is this a problem to take these two worlds and these two languages and put them in the same sentence?
Well, I would say that indeed we have different, maybe not languages, but at least different conceptual schemes when we think of science, cognitive science on one hand, and philosophy on the other. However, I don't believe that these are the only conceptual schemes that matter here. The most important one is what I would call the ordinary language conceptual scheme. The term decision, or the term free will, we'll probably discuss later, the term choice, are all the terms which belong to the ordinary language, to what we may call the folk psychological view of the world. The way how we, living in a certain culture, see the actions of other peoples, understand those actions, and so on and so on. And now, I believe that when we think of philosophy, we are thinking of making those folk psychological notions more precise. So I do experience my decision-making process in one way or another. I usually interpret it in terms of this folk psychological conceptual scheme, and then I start theorizing, building a philosophical theory, for instance. So I take some aspects of my experience, some aspects of the experience of the previous generations which are embedded in the conceptual scheme used in ordinary language, and I end up with some, usually very fancy, philosophical theory of what a decision is, what a choice is. The problem is, I believe that there may be very different philosophical theories of choice, of free choice, and so on and so on. Therefore, there is no one philosophical definition of this phenomenon.
Well, okay, so can I interject? What would be a neurological definition of something like a free decision? Because I noticed that in actual journal articles, the term free will is not that much used. You wouldn't probably use it that much in a paper for Nature Neuroscience. But the term free decision does occur. I mean, can you even define precisely the term free decision in neuroscientific terms?
So, first of all, when we talk about psychology or mental states and brain states, we have different ways of accessing the kind of states of a person. And they're given in quite different ways. One is the kind of subjective level of experience, which is kind of my conscious experience. That's something that I might report. And the other side is a measurement of my brain. Now, people tend traditionally to be dualist about this. They tend to think that their mind is somehow separate from their brain. I'd say modern brain science believes that that's not the case. Until 20, 30 years ago, this dualism, this separation between mind and brain, was kind of quite common to experience. But today, most brain scientists would assume that the brain is the carrier of the mind, or somehow the organ in which the mind manifests itself. So when you, first of all, want to study some psychological process, you're looking at these two signals at the same time, some signal related to the behavior and to the mental states of a person, and others related to the brain processes. And we're trying to link these two in some explanatory framework. So that just ahead. So when we say a free decision, it's not so much something that we would say a brain state is free in that sense. But when we say a free decision, what we mean with that is a decision that the person experiences to be free. And it doesn't matter whether this decision is actually free. The question is whether the person believes or feels to be free. That's what we mean with a free decision.
But what would it mean
neuroscience.
To be actually free? What do you mean by actually free?
Well, exactly.
If you want to...
So that's the second question. So you've got the subjective state. That is about what a person feels or believes to be true about their decisions. The other side is a scientific, possibly more normative description of whether we scientifically think the decision is free. And I'd say there are multiple ways of assigning freedom, and if we look into lay psychology, we've done some research on what lay people believe free decisions are. But let's leave that aside for the moment. I'd say generally, the kind of like the big picture kind of subdivision is on the one hand, the question is whether you're free in the sense that your environment doesn't impose any impediments on you. If you come to a crossing and one of them is gated, you can't take that path. That's external freedom or freedom of action. When it comes to internal states, I'd say roughly, with kind of doing a lot of injustice of obviously the subtleties, there is a big distinction between some people who follow the determinist definition of freedom, or the kind of freedom as an opposite to determinism, in the sense that a decision is not fully constrained by the laws of nature that govern the brain processes.
Yeah.
That's one sense of freedom. And the way this manifests itself is, in the extreme determinist position, would be your brain is in this certain state, or you can take a different perspective, the whole world is in a certain state, and the next state that's going to happen in the world is fully determined by the state that happens before. Unfortunately, that's something we can't prove, because in order to prove determinism, we would have to repeat the history of the universe and show that when we come to exactly the same state, the same thing happens again. Very difficult to do. The other sense of freedom is that pertains to, and this is more like a philosophical interpretation of freedom. I think it's very counterintuitive, this approach. But philosophers often, or many philosophers, they would say freedom is more about the source of my action. Where does my action come from? For example, does my action originate in my beliefs? Does it originate in my causal reasoning, in my motives, things like that, as opposed, for example, but just being a reflex or something very low level that doesn't involve any causal contribution of these higher level belief systems. I think that's something that a lot of philosophers care about when they define freedom. I don't find this definition very plausible. And we could discuss why I don't think that's plausible.
This is probably because you actually, in fact, study from the external perspective people's beliefs or intentions, for instance.
I don't quite agree. First and foremost, I'm a psychologist. I'm a psychologist who does also neuroscience. So the subjective perspective of the people is, for me, the most important. What they believe to be true, that's for me the starting point, and then I try and explain that with the brain. But I think, actually, I'd go the other way, and this might be a slightly more controversial point. And that is, I think the reason why most people in philosophy want to introduce reasons and motives and arguments is because ultimately what they need free will for is a basis for responsibility. And I think that free will is much better stripped free of this intent to use it as a support for responsibility. And I think free will should be defined in the sense of the question whether there is or not an alternate possibility when you come to a point of action, and that the issues of arguments, beliefs, and motives should be used when you argue for responsibility. I think that's the mixing up of these two issues, I think, is what is largely responsible for this debate.
Okay, but so far we have sort of two separate issues. One would be defining freedom, and the second would be how, the uses of freedom. But I will come back to the definition thing, because I think there's more to dig in there. But the second issue, would you agree that we could separate it? Could there be responsibility? Could there be legal responsibility if there were no freedom of decision?
Before we turn to this problem, I would like to re-emphasize the problem of conceptual schemes of languages or different languages. I think what John said is a very nice illustration of the problems. So he indicated a number of problems that may emerge once we start mixing those languages. For instance, if a psychologist, a neuroscientist, tries to do some experiment concerning free will, what they do is, on the one hand, register certain neural activities using an fMRI or some other scientific instrument, while asking people to do some tasks and at the same time referring their experiences. And now, so we have two pictures of the same phenomenon. The one picture is the thing recorded by the equipment, of course interpreted, so there's a lot of things involved in it. So you have sequences of numbers coming from the fMRI, which need to be interpreted in one way or another by a special algorithm, and then at a higher level interpreted in view of some psychological theories we have. So it's not such a simple thing. It's a complex problem, of course. On the other hand, we have subjective reports of an individual saying, okay, for instance, I've become aware of this decision at this point of time. In fact, we have two different perspectives on the same problem here. And now the question is how to relate the two. For instance, what I was trying to say before, the experience of a free decision is not something we are born with, in the sense that it depends on the culture we live in. So the same experience, or more or less the same situation, may give rise to completely different experiences in people belonging to the Western culture or Far Eastern culture. So the experience of free will for an American or a German person may be completely different, looking from the perspective of the subjective report, than an experience of someone, of a Japanese or a Chinese person. So this shows that what I call the folk psychological conceptual scheme, our understanding of our actions in the world, of our intentions, our beliefs, as well as actions and intentions of others, hangs together with a lot of various aspects of the culture we belong to. So there is no one folk psychological view of free will. We have reports embedded in a certain culture, and that's one thing, and the other is what the equipment registers with all the interpretational problems involved. So the big tension and the big problem here is how to relate those two pictures, those two perspectives.
But I think we can all agree that there is a phenomenon of subjective freedom, in the sense that people would report universally that they have the freedom, that they make decisions, or not. Is it not a universal sentiment?
It is and it isn't. This is exactly the point. Because if you have two people belonging to completely different culture, experiencing a similar circumstances, experiencing a similar choice problem, similar task, cognitive task, and their reports are completely different. One of them may say, okay, I feel that I should do this. Why? Well, because this is what is done in my society. This is not real or free choice. This is almost completely determined by the social structure of a Far Eastern society, because they are much more society-oriented than Western people belonging to the Western culture.
Well, perhaps I could argue way in here, because I mean we've done studies on that. We've actually done the first representative studies using an instrument called the Freewill Inventory that gives you a measure of people's beliefs in free will. And we did this in the US, in Singapore, and in Germany. And it was very interesting. That free will inventory doesn't ask people about specific cases. It asks more generally if people believe, for example, that you always have the freedom to do otherwise and things like that. And interestingly, in that aspect, these three cultures didn't differ. Yeah. But I do believe, as you say, they will differ in the evaluation of specific instances. But the general belief that humans have the ability to do otherwise seems to be almost universal. I mean, this is overwhelming that people believe in free will, at least in these three cultures. We actually thought that something like the US and Singapore, we'd have kind of very different ends of the cultural spectrum, and we were actually quite surprised that when it came to the beliefs in free will that these cultures would be so similar.
But I think if we simplify it into a simple laboratory situation, I think you can kind of distill it. Because I can imagine that if you ask a person from a very different culture than ours, which is a very individualistic culture, I think that are your life decisions, the decision that you became a painter or a baker, was it a free decision? I think people from different cultures would be differently willing to admit that this was my decision, or this was the will of gods or destiny, for instance. But in a simple laboratory situation, when you present two people with two buttons, A and B, I think in this simple situation, I guess there would be a more universal agreement than this is actually that they at the moment decide or not.
So the reason we started off with these, what we call opinion polls or representative surveys, and what some philosophers call experimental philosophy, is because I very often gave talks about neuroscience and free will. What I experienced was often mere stipulations about whether these experiments were captured what lay people or our common intuitions about free will. So that's why I had a PhD student, Robert Deutschlander, and a philosophical colleague of mine, Michael Pound. We sat down and we thought of kind of surveys that we could do in order to find out whether people would consider these very simple laboratory decisions free or not. So classically in the philosophical debate that I've encountered with people like compatibilist philosophers, we'd always be faced with this kind of argument like, yes, these laboratory decisions where that appear random between, say, a left button and a right button where there's no reason to prefer one or the other or no differential payoff, that's not free will that you're exerting, that's just randomness. Whereas if you have a reason to pick one or the other, that's when you can exert your free will. So we actually studied this. We asked lay people, and I'm not saying that lay people should be determining kind of theoretical constructs used within a discipline. But let's just look at the lay people. Let's just see how intuitive this is. And what came out of that was that people judged those decisions, as in these Libet experiments, these laboratory experiments, as most free. When they're seemingly arbitrary, there are no differential consequences between them. There are no reasons to pick one or the other. That's what they judged free. And the cases, in fact, where there were reasons to pick one or the other, they thought that that was particularly unfree. And I think there's a good reason. Because if there's a reason to pick one over the other, then you're constrained. People feel constrained by their reasons. So in fact, you could almost argue that having a reason is something that constrains or impedes your free will rather than being an implementation of your free will.
Let me get this straight. So let's say that you have the two buttons, or I have button A and button B, but then I'm told that if I press button B, then my family will get a lot of money, for instance. Yeah. And I mean, again, neuroscientifically speaking, this would basically only mean that different parts of the brain light up. Maybe those related to my emotion toward my family, or I'm starting to think about the consequences of the extra money. I'm going to make my family happy, as you do with money. Maybe this is going to happen. I'm going to go to a doctor or something. But again, I wanted to strip this down. It basically means that different parts of an organ are active. Is it really a philosophical difference?
Well, I mean, according to many philosophers, it is, because many philosophers would argue, I mean, they're from the reason responsiveness camp, they would argue that a decision is free. What it involves your reasons, it involves your beliefs. So you kind of have a rational level of analysis based on argumentation and consideration of the consequences, etc. That is the case which is free. And I'm fully with you. I think that's a professional deformation. I think that is a case where, and kind of my analysis of this is looking from the outside, is there's a contamination of the free will debate by the desire to make the free will debate match up with the responsibility debate. And you kind of importing things into the free will debate that actually belong into the domain of responsibility. And of course, you're free to define free will however you want. Whatever helps you with your theory, but you might want to think about entering interdisciplinary debates when you start talking with people from other disciplines, or you engage the general public, and you might even engage the general public in a way with statements like, oh, there is free will versus there is no free will, and this has certain consequences for our legal system and for criminal law, etc. In these cases, you want to be really careful that you don't use a very counterintuitive definition of free will. Yeah.
And this is something I wanted to ask you. So this was the first case was just button A, button B, no difference, just different lights lit up. Second case was no money for my family, money for my family. But let's say there was a third case. The left button just pops a balloon, and the right button causes a lethal injection to be, injected into a person. So it's basically murder versus no murder. Would that be a difference? Is this the same experiment, or is it a different experiment? And my freedom in making the choice, is it the same kind of freedom, or is it a different kind of freedom?
Well, it's quite easy to answer the first question. The second question is ill-posed. It's a nonsensical question in a sense. Because in case of the first question, of course these are different experiments. Because the fact that when I'm pressing the left button or pressing the right button, there are consequences which are connected with the knowledge of the world we have, which is some kind embodied in our brains and in our bodies. What I mean is that if we could imagine that our mind or our brain is a tabula rasa, so it's like a clean sheet, there is nothing inscribed there, then of course those three experiments would be the same. But once there are consequences attached to the choices we make, other than just a buzz or a red light flashing, then what our mind unconsciously does is to activate a lot of the knowledge of the world we have. So for instance, I know the financial state of my family. I know that, well, this money would mean paying a mortgage or buying a new car, which is very important, or paying for a difficult surgery, and so on and so on. And then, well, all those states, or some of them at least, activate, and they are connected with a lot of emotional reactions, which are also activated, and they say, okay, I need to put, it's almost automatic that I push the red button then. So I do not have any chain of reasoning connected with it. It's the choice itself, the way it is phrased, is something which activates all this knowledge I have in my mind, and then well, and the second question you asked, whether these are the same, this is the same kind of freedom. I cannot find one simple scheme into which I can put different kinds of freedoms which are comparable, commeasurable in any way. So it's a completely, so from the point of view, from the objective scientific point of view, it's more or less the same freedom in the sense that it's just pushing the button. Of course, something happens, but I can record it in the same way. I can analyze it in the same way. It's more or less the same problem. From the point of view of what I call the folk psychological conceptual scheme and personal experience, these are completely different situations, which we experience in a completely different way. And here, this is the last sentence, I'm not surprised that people reported that they find an experiment in which it's just pushing one of the two buttons as more free than deciding whether they want to devote the money to going for holiday or spending it on poor children. Or
So does that mean you would agree that the idea of free will based on reason responsiveness is misguided?
I have a problem with the idea of reason responsiveness.
Okay, good. But,
for two reasons.
Yeah.
The first one is that it's a linguistic reason. It's a smaller problem. I think that speaking of reasons is typical for English language. it is almost impossible to translate reason into Polish. I think also into German. It's not as easy as it may seem to have the same network of connected concepts, and to so when philosophers, moral philosophers, speak of reason responsiveness, I have a problem with that. The other is that how to understand it really. The other problem is more profound, I think, is that we are, let's stick to this idiom, to reason responsiveness. I believe that if we are reason responsive, most of it goes in the unconscious level. So our brain and our minds, which in one way or another result from the workings of our brains and bodies, are attuned to the environment. So when we encounter, so there of course there are various neuropsychological explanations, like the somatic marker hypothesis of Damasios, but also there are others. So once we encounter a situation, we are a special kind of response is activated in an unconscious way. Does it mean it is unreasonable? Does it mean reasons are not involved? And so I see someone suffering lying on the street, and I call the ambulance. I don't think about it. I don't weigh reasons for and against it. I just do it. Does it mean it is not responsive?
So we've certainly got a convergence there, because I guess the idea that our beliefs and our kind of decisions are based on like internal argumentation, or are not psychological reality. I don't think that describes the decision-making process very well.
In one lecture about free will, you've ended with the call to wait 20 years before we ask philosophers. I think this is basically what you didn't want to happen, right? So you say, let's wait 20 years. Okay, but let's say we do have all the information, and we do have all the data.
I should just say why. Because I think with the limit experiments and with our choice prediction experiments, there's a lot of speculation about what these experiments might mean without that much in terms of studies that kind of provides the neuroscientific basis. And for example, I would say I don't think that the experiments on predicting choices are going to contribute to the problem of free will. There's no point, because we've shown that it's a causal chain that can be terminated. So if that's the case, it's a dead end towards arguing for determinism. I would take a different route for argumentation. And the route of argumentation, because what you're after is saying somehow this belief that people have when they make a decision, they seem to believe that they can choose, they can still change their mind until a very late state, a point in time, when actually they can't. So where does this determination come from when it doesn't come from the prior brain states? I mean, ultimately, that's where the causal chain comes from, these prior brain states. But the question is, what's a better way of demonstrating this based on neuroscience? And I think the better way of demonstrating this based on neuroscience, that more directly and more heads-on gets at the heart of the matter of the challenge of the lay belief, how we make a decision, is to show, and I think neuroscience has done that quite convincingly, that our decisions, when we make up our mind at that time, not previously, which is very hard to track, but right at the time when we make up our mind, that is implemented as a process in the brain. So what I would say, what neuroscience has shown is convincingly, not 100%, but I think it's much more convincing that neuroscience has cast serious doubts on dualistic positions. So the idea that your mind can be separate, at least to some degree, from your brain state. I'd say that is actually the success story of neuroimaging. The success story is to show, look, your mind is implemented in your brain. The brain is like a carrier of your mental processes. And for that reason, your mind inherits whatever you want to say, the laws of nature, the causal mechanisms, whatever you want to call them. You can fill in your favorite little theory there. that govern the physiology, the kind of physical manifestation in terms of brain mechanisms, that whatever governs that, you inherit the same level of determination. So when you get on an airplane, you think it's more or less deterministic, governed by the laws of nature, or you think your heart is governed by the laws of nature, then you should also think that your brain is governed by the laws of nature, and consequently that your decisions are governed by the laws of nature. I'm not saying that straightforward, that there's a simple if-then relationship, because obviously it's a very complicated process, like the weather. It's a very complicated process, but we don't think that the weather isn't governed by the laws of nature. It's just incredibly complex. And I'd say the same is with the brain. We don't believe that the brain isn't governed by the laws of nature. It's just very complex. So if we show that our mental states, and including our decisions, are implemented by the brain, all we have to say is, then you inherit whatever kind of lawfulness relationship you might want to hold for the brain. And I think that's what neuroscience can contribute. And I just like to extend that. That is exactly the problem that people have. So we did more opinion polls, and the opinion polls we did were not just on whether people believe in free will, but also in the US, Singapore, and Germany, whether people believe in dualism. And it's shocking. Most people overwhelmingly believe in dualism. They believe that the mind is separable from the brain. So they're dualists. So the reason people don't perceive a tension between free will and determinism is because they think there is something about the mind that is separable from the brain and lives in some dualistic closet of the mind, and that's the true problem.
I mean, even papers in neuroscientific journals are methodologically dualistic in the sense that there are two separate languages used and two separate sources, and one of them would be asking people about their state of mind, and the second would be asking the machine of the state of the brain. I mean, it's not a big surprise that people, when polled, turn out to be dualists, because basically, I mean, you can't even do your research without being sort of linguistically or methodologically kind of dualist, right? Could you do your research? Could you do any research in neuroscience without using any language related to mind, states of mind, subjectivity, and so on? Could you just do it just speaking about brain?
I think you couldn't. And the reason is because the brain is other than just some gas that can be stochastically described. It's something that has mesoscopic and macroscopic states. And these macroscopic states are what we use in order to predict people's behavior. We don't need to understand the stochastics of the neurons. We need to understand the lawfulness that emerges at a macroscopic state. And I think that's why people tend to be dualists, because the processes are given to them at different levels of resolution.
But we are coming back again to those two images of the world. Because if you put it in this way, that from the scientific point of view, everything, including not only our brains, but also our minds, are governed by the laws of physics. Well, it's nothing new. It's an obvious.
It's absolutely not new.
It's an obvious assumption.
But I wouldn't say minds. I would say brains definitely, but
mind too. I mean, well, this is the assumption behind.
No, people don't believe that to be true.
Just let me finish this. Those three sentences. So, when you look at the practice of science and at the method of science, it is one of the assumptions of the scientific endeavor that everything is explainable with the method. So everything is explainable with the method in which you construct mathematical models and test them. So in a way, everything is reducible to the laws of physics. So from this perspective, from this methodological perspective, which is embedded in the practice of science, there is no other way that this is how science works. Of course, it's not that visible, and it is maybe more complicated when it comes to biology, neuroscience, or psychology even, because you don't have such good mathematical models. The higher you go, the more difficult it gets to construct models, mathematical models of reality. But this is one thing, and from this perspective, well, this is quite obvious that we at least assume that everything, including our minds, should be explainable with recourse to the universal laws of physics.
But who do you mean with we? Because I'd say cognitive neuroscientists will mostly believe exactly that. But I'm not talking about cognitive neuroscientists here. I'm talking about lay people. Because when we do brain science, we can do brain science among brain scientists, but we can then try and see how this reaches out to other disciplines. And I'd say then it looks quite different. And people there don't seem to believe that the mind is fully explainable by the brain.
This is again exactly the point. Because there is the second perspective, what I call the folk psychological perspective, but what you can call a layperson perspective, or the manifest image of the word, as one of the Wilfried Sellers, I think, put it. So this is the way all the people who are not trained in doing science tend to perceive the world. And now there's a number of interesting questions which follow from this fact, that most people tend to be dualists. First, is it something purely cultural, or is it something hardwired into our brains? And there are different arguments. For instance, there is this famous book by Paul Bloom, the American psychologist, I think the Cart Babies or something like that, in which he argues that maybe not from the moment we are born, but very early in individual development, people or human infants, develop two different ways of looking at the world. So they perceive physical things in a different way that they perceive persons. So he argues that we are dualists almost from the very beginning, or maybe even from the very beginning. So this is one question we can ask here. If this would be the case, that our dualistic perception of the world, so that we perceive physical objects in a different way than we perceive people and social interactions, is hardwired, I would say that it would be probably impossible to import the scientific image of the world and the assumption that the mind is reducible to the laws of physics into our everyday perception of social interaction, into our social institutions such as morality or law, and so on and so on. So this is an interesting question, one of the interesting questions which follows from.
I fully agree with you on that. But that's not about the free will debate. That's a different debate. So if you want to say that a person, when they make a decision, could have done otherwise, in the sense that they could change the course of the universe at the point in time when they decide and make themselves independent of the history of their brain, I'd say it's very implausible scientifically. Science hasn't proven it because we don't have that level of predictive power, but it's very it's what a scientist would believe to be true. So, but people believe that they can change the course of the universe because they have these dualistic intentions. But so when law or in some kind of normative assessment then wants to use that, then we have to make this contact. We have to say this belief is definitely wrong. We know that that is wrong. We would say we've got very strong reasons to believe that that is wrong. But when it comes to other ways of assessing actions in terms of normative frameworks like responsibility, I think then we're free to open up the full box of cognitive neuroscience and then think about, well, what kind of actions do we want to sanction? What are the typical criteria that we use in sanctioning actions? And how could they then be redescribed in terms of cognitive neuroscience? I think that is the contribution that cognitive neuroscience can make then, is not to prove that there is no free will. I think we've got strong reasons to believe that in this sense of alternate possibilities, that's not the case. But I think what cognitive neuroscience, another thing it can do, is it can help you understand in terms of a more naturalistic model about how these kind of decisions come about that we then want to sanction or that we don't want to sanction based on normative frameworks.
Would you agree that even if we can't really define free decision making in well thought out neurological terms, at least we have to assume that they do exist? I mean, or is it not that easy? I mean, I want to end, I don't want to make a vote, it's not a Monty Python skit, but at least some sort of agreement that we now know a lot about the processes that occur before I realize I make a decision. But would you agree that it doesn't really matter that much to society? I don't want to make your research seem unimportant to the society, but I get the feeling from listening to you that we have to assume that people make decisions, and even if we learned hypothetically that they completely not, and we have a hypothetical situation of a person inside a brain scanner committing a crime, then even if a person like you would say, okay, I could predict it an hour ago, we would still punish the person because it doesn't really matter that much. Am I thinking
I don't
straight,
think that the prediction has very much to do with the responsibility assessment. I think they're two separate things. The prediction has a little bit to do with the issue of freedom in the sense of alternate possibilities, but very watered down, and I'd even challenge that to some degree. But obviously, when we want to understand the nature of our mind, the brain can give us some valuable clues there. And so in that sense, understanding the brain mechanisms of decisions can be very valuable. They might help us shape and sharpen our theories of decision making. So I do think that the brain has a lot to contribute to this enterprise. But if we want to make a prediction of someone's behavior, the best way to make a prediction of their behavior is not to measure their brain activity, but is to ask them. And that says a lot. It says a lot about...
It's very old school.
It says a lot. Well, I think it's always very important. I'm a passionate cognitive neuroscientist, but I think it's very important to know exactly what cognitive neuroscience can tell you and what it's not going to tell you. And for practical purposes in day-to-day life, where you don't even have access to another person's brain states, a theory or a prediction based on a brain is not going to help you very much. A prediction based on a person's behavior that is accessible to you, you can see a person's behavior, they can tell you what they want to do, all these behavioral criteria, that's what you have accessible in day-to-day life. And that's why I think for practical purposes, in most day-to-day situations, psychological methods will have much more usefulness and much more predictive power than brain-based predictions. And I'm saying that just because I think we shouldn't also expect too much from brain science, and we should leave brain science where it is. Brain science is there to understand the neural mechanisms of psychological processes. Brain science at the moment isn't there to make predictions about what a person in an everyday situation is going to do.
Okay. And as a final question, in 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, do you see this changing, or is it like separate kingdoms?
Well, I hope that we, in 50 years, will understand more about the neural realization of psychological processes, and I also hope that neuroscience will have further contributed to constraining the possible psychological theories so that there's a kind of like a mutual benefit there. So I do hope that that's going to be the case. I also think that for certain applications, of course, looking in the brain can be particularly sensible. For example, when you look at lie detection. I don't think that lie detection is a technique that is feasible at the moment based on brain signals, but I'd say in principle, it might be possible to look in the brain to get information about persons' tendencies to deceive. That's an application that I would see, but again, that's not there yet, but that might be an application. So so in 50 years, we might find that we can't lie anymore in court because we have a brain scanner where a light flashes up and light's red every time we lie. I don't think that's particularly likely, but it could happen, and then the brain would have contributed to that.
Okay. And as a final question to you, do you see this scenario happening, and do you think it's wanted? Do we want a situation like this? And do you expect a revolution in the way society is organized, because in 50, 100 years we will just know certain things about the contents of the human mind? Or do you think it's just like, just an area of study and we're not going to have a revolution?
Well, we've already witnessing a kind of slow revolution. If you if you think about the way philosophers, even psychologists, thought about decision making 50 years ago or 60 years ago, before Kahneman and Tversky came and other people showing how the unconscious level contributes to the decision making, what kind of mistakes, systematic mistakes we do at this intuitive level and so on. So I think that the revolution is a slow revolution. So it's something between a revolution and evolution. I don't know how to call it, but it's taking place. And I think that in the next 20 or 50 or 100 years, I hope that the progress will be maybe even bigger. So we will surely understand much better how our brain functions, how our bodies functions, how they contribute to our behavior. So this is one dimension. I cannot predict what we will know, because if I could, then, you know.
Put your right hand on the Bible and your left hemisphere into the reader, and now we can proceed.
The second dimension is I hope that at least some of what we learned will migrate to other areas, like to law, for instance. That lawyers will at least try to re-evaluate some of their institutions and some of the interpretations of legal codes and so on in light of this better knowledge of human behavior. However, I do not believe that the basic principles will change in any way, because I think that the law and other social institutions are based on what I call the folk psychological view of the world, or folk psychological view of agency. And so I cannot imagine a legal system in which there is no responsibility, there is so I think that the main principles according to which our societies function will not change drastically. I cannot imagine that. I think that this what I call the folk psychological perception of human behavior, this is something which that may change, but the changes take a lot of time. Well, you can trace it in literature, for instance. When you read Jane Austen's book. Well, those people there are more sentimental than we are. So they have a bit different perception of human interactions, but the difference is not so huge. So we can imagine some cultural changes to this, but I do not expect a revolution here.
Okay. Any other final thoughts?
Thank you.
Final statements?
Well, I'd say that one thing that I think neuroscience might contribute beyond that in the next 50 years is that it's going to make dualistic positions less and less credible. So I think the big thing we're going to learn from neuroscience as humans, and lay people can learn from neuroscience, is to challenge their dualistic beliefs. If I were to say the one thing that we can teach people based on neuroscience, it's that they should stop being dualists. It's going to be very hard to do, because I would follow your statement from earlier on that we might just be hardwired to be dualists. But I'd say it's going to become more and more difficult to be dualists. And I'd say the thought experiment is that if we could attach a personal brain scanner to everyone's head and measure their brain and show the brain activity in interaction, saying during a debate like this, it will become more and more apparent that what we perceive as something that exists at a psychological level independent of the brain actually has a material manifestation.
But I know I wanted to wrap up, but I just can't, hold on, can't resist. But is it good that dualism will recede according to your prediction? I mean, I can imagine a situation where people would totally use it as an excuse for a lack of responsibility. I mean, I didn't do it, my brain did it.
Well, that's exactly, I think, what
I think it's good that we are
well,
dualists.
I think that's exactly
right?
What I would take out of this debate is that this doesn't undermine your responsibility, because there will be certain kinds of processes for which you are held responsible, and they are those where reasons play a role, for example, whereas there's others where you act more reflexively, you won't be held responsible. So I don't think that it's going to change the basic nature of the normative assessments that we make.
But being held responsible is not going to force you to feel responsible. Okay, but I think we're heading into another debate. Okay, thank you, gentlemen, for being here and having, quite an in-depth look into, I wouldn't say that much free will, but definitely decision-making and responsibility and brain. And thank you for listening, and stay tuned to other big questions that we do, because there's going to be much, much more. Thank you very much, and thank you.